That's shedding, but Anna, because SECAP का training कर रहे हैं ना.
I'm shedding. Has Anna joined?
I just messaged her. I think she got a little confused with the time, so I just messaged her on Teams. I can call her about the issue when she's on.
Yeah. Because we had said we didn't change the SECAP timing. It was always 1:30 to 2:30 or 1:30 to 3, I think. Oh no, you're right. It was earlier from 2 p.m. and now it's 1:30. You're right.
Yeah, I got a message to her, so let me message her again.
Okay, so
I'm sorry about that. I had understood that it was starting at my presentation was at 10:30 wrong time, so I misunderstood the time.
yeah, no, that's fine, Anna. And so Anna, this is Meera, and we are all now back from lunch. We had to reschedule because we had to adjust the ECG presentations in the afternoon. So we advanced your presentation, and I shared the revised thing yesterday. Maybe you didn't get into the details, but we have your presentation. Should we upload it, or will you use from your end?
I can share it from my end, just that way I can change it myself. Is that okay?
Can we give her the sharing rights? Yeah.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can. So, thank you. And we have in the room a large audience, Anna, starting with the project director, Ms. Nitika, and all the team members of the state PMU, as well as district PMU, as well as partner organizations who are going to be associated in the implementation of the project. But for the benefit of our audience, just to say that SECAP is a core component of all our designs, and SECAP compliance is now very important and critical as part of the reporting requirements, and also the way we implement in the field and how it influences the quality of implementation. So there is always a detailed SECAP that is prepared with every design, and Anna, who is the specialist on climate and environment based in IFAC headquarters in Rome, will take us through SECAP in general, but also how it relates to the REAP project. So over to you, Anna.
Yes, thank you so much, Meera, and apologies again for the confusion on the timing. Can you just confirm that the session is 1 hour, but it will have time also for questions and interaction?
So it is 1 hour, but we can stretch by 10-15 minutes because we have a tea break after your session, so if required.
Okay, no, I will try to finish before that. I just wanted to make sure. In some parts I will go through quickly because I think that they have already been covered at this stage, but I think it's kind of good background for the team if you're not familiar already with EFAT's SECAP procedures. So yeah, I'll get started. As Mira mentioned, the SECAP is EFAT's environmental, social, and climate assessment procedure, and takes place in the requirement of all EFAT financing, and has different kind of requirements and steps at different stages across the project cycle. So just quickly, the main objectives of the SECAP are to set priorities for adopting guiding values and principles to promote high social, environmental, and climate adaptation benefits. Suitable part of the process is always finding suitable entry points in the project cycle for meeting these requirements and having different, as I mentioned, requirements at different stages of the project cycle, and also depending on certain ratings that the project receives, the requirements will differ, which I'll go into later specifically for this project. The SECAP also helps to mainstream social, environmental, and climate sustainability into all project activities and ensures effective stakeholder engagement, including a procedure to respond to direct complaints from project affected individuals or communities. So grievance mechanisms are a key point as well for EFAT system.
थोड़ा वॉल्यूम नहीं बढ़ा सकते क्या?
So the understanding is that this project is EFAT's 2017 SECAP edition. It has since been updated, but we are applying the 2017 edition as that was what was used originally. Mentioned all EFAT funded investment to go through this process and all activities under any project receiving funding from EFAT, so including co-financing or any of those finance that I'll skip over this. So some of the key principles of SECAP, as well as any other environmental, social procedures for these are to do no harm, so avoid negative impacts where possible, and in the case where there are, to minimize, reduce, and mitigate or compensate in that order. So saying the first priority is to do no harm, but then to minimize, to reduce, to mitigate harm that is done, or to compensate for that harm. To do good, identify and support sustainable approaches to environmental and social benefits, inform the public and enable people to participate in decisions which affect them and their livelihoods, and to integrate environmental and social aspects into the project identification, design, and implementation. And as well as sort of management and monitoring capacity. So again, the guiding principles, I won't read them all, but these are the guiding principles to achieve some of these things. I mentioned how to do no harm, including addressing the vulnerability and adaptation priorities of rural people, avoid involuntary resettlement, and all of the guidance material, which I've also included links for all of this information, and you can have further discussion, helps you to identify at which stage of the project certain things should be addressed. There's guiding questions that need to be asked at different stages, and a lot of kind of supporting documentation to help project teams follow the guiding values and principles of EFAT. So in terms of entry points, as I mentioned, this is like a key aspect of the SECAP where at different stages of the project cycle, there's different requirements for the SECAP. So during the country strategy, so the COSAP and the CSN, a SECAP background study is required. In terms of projects, at the concept stage, it's required that a social, environmental, and climate screening is prepared, which has been done for this project. At early design or during design in general, Based on the results of the screening, a SECAP review note and additional assessments are required. Some of the assessments are listed here, but I'll go into more detailed. And then again, depending on the results of the original screening and review note during implementation, there's environmental social impact assessment, environmental social management plan are required depending on the risk categories of the project. So the general approach to preparing a screening for the SECAP are looking first at the main physical, biological, socioeconomic, physical, cultural resources, climate scenarios, etc. So a lot of the data related to physical and environmental variables. Secondly, to draw on experts' opinions. So looking at things such as resettlement, climate infrastructure. So going beyond data and information, but also making sure that you engage experts in this process, national experts, local experts. Capitalize on existing information and studies for similar projects or experience in or outside the country. So I think in particular in the early stages, when you do this original screening and review note, a lot of the information can come from previous environmental social assessments that have been prepared either by IFAD or by other organizations, institutions. And then aligning with the country framework and regulation, and finally using climate environmental profiles and other guidance statements. So in terms of the risk categories that are given to based on the original SECAP requirements, there's 3 categories. Category A is when the program or project may have significant adverse environmental or social implications that are, this is important, that are sensitive, irreversible, and unprecedented, affect an area broader than the sites or facilities subject to the physical interventions of the project and are not readily remedied by preventative actions. So this is the highest risk category. Category B, which I'm highlighting here, is what the project was rated as, means that the program or project may have some adverse environmental or social impacts on human populations, but they're less adverse for those than category A. They're often site specific and few are, very importantly again, few are irreversible. So there's potential to mitigate some of the risks or adverse impacts and can be remedied by appropriate preventative actions or mitigation measures. So, and then finally, category C means that the program or project will have negligible or no environmental or social implications, which in that case, of course, there are the least requirements moving forward in terms of ensuring that there's management plans in place or assessments that need to be done. Similarly, for the climate risk classifications, there are 3 classifications: high risk, moderate risk, and low risk. It's my understanding that this project was rated as high risk in terms of climate, which means that the program or project can be expected to be highly vulnerable to climate-related hazards. So in this case, it's referring more to the vulnerability and risk of climate to the system or to the project area. And this was rated as high. I can go into the details of why that is if there's questions about it. Moderate risk projects, which are the program project can expected to be moderately sensitive to climate risks, and low risk, they're not likely to be vulnerable to climate risks. And again here, the requirements for how you manage these risks and consider them throughout the project implementation will depend on how they're rated during the design, but then also this should be continuously monitored and updated throughout the process. So the implications, as I mentioned, differ for different categorizations. For the category B of environmental and social screening, means that there's a requirement for an environmental and social analysis. And also, as has already been started for this project, an environmental and social management plan outlining key aspects of how these risks will be monitored and managed throughout the project. And I'll go into details of what is required in terms of management planning and what has been done so far for this project. For high climate risk projects, is required an in-depth climate risk analysis, which will be separate from the environmental and social analysis, and needs to, in particular, look at historical and future projected trends in climate and how this may impact the different interventions of the project differently, and how we can kind of foresee the mitigation measures based on this analysis. And so this is a requirement as well, importantly to highlight for this project, which was rated as high climate risk. So this is the overview of the SECAP review note, which I mentioned I have a lot of slides, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because it's already been prepared for this project. But it basically, the main components are environmental, social, climate context of the project area and key risks and impacts related to project interventions. Yeah, this is some information taken from the project, so I'm not going to include this here. I'm not going to talk about it here because it's going back to the project documentation. But instead go straight into the environmental and social management plan, which is a requirement as this is a category B project. So talking here about the environmental social management plan, the role it has and what the main content is, what the institutional arrangements are for implementing this plan. Basically, what the environmental and social management plan is an action plan that indicates which of the recommendations and alternatives from environmental and social assessment study report will actually be adopted and implemented. So the the environmental social assessment report will often explore different options for managing risks. And those options can have different benefits or challenges, and those need to be assessed. And then in the management plan, those which actions are most relevant based on this study need to be selected. The most important link to incorporate environmental social factors into the project design. So it's basically linking the assessment of environmental social risks to the project design itself and making sure that there's a very clear linkage between what was determined as a risk, what the solutions are, and then what is incorporated into the project design. And it ensures also environmental and social mitigation measures and their practical monitoring become a legal responsibility of the government or the borrower, and is embedded in the financing agreement. Yep, so the environmental social management plan, it details the measures that are to be taken out during the implementation and operation of a project, sub-project, to eliminate or offset adverse environmental and social impacts or to reduce them to acceptable levels. And then the actions needed, this is important, I think, here for the monitoring, supervision, reporting requirements. So implementation arrangements, institutional responsibilities, time schedule for these, and the costs to implement these measures. So who prepares the ESMP? It's part of the environmental social assessment that is prepared and financed by the borrower. In the case of F5 projects, the ESMP should be prepared by the sub-borrower. The borrower often places an existing PIU in charge of tasks such as the environmental social management plan and management framework. The borrower may also hire local or international consultants to assist the PIU in preparing the ESMPs. So a quick summary of what a good ESMP includes. This is just an overview again. I'm going to give some quick examples of example ESMPs and talk about what has been prepared so far for this project. But in summary, it should include a summary of the predicted adverse environmental and social risks and impacts, description of mitigation measures and plan, description of monitoring activities and plan, institutional arrangements, including training, implementation schedule and reporting procedures, and estimated related costs and sources of the funds. The mitigation plan, what is included in a mitigation plan? It defines the key environmental and social issues that should be managed, describes the specific mitigation measures to manage each possible impact, including specific actions to be achieved. It identifies the authorities responsible for implementing, monitoring, and reporting, and presents associated estimated costs. In terms of mitigation measures, this was just one example that was included in another presentation of when talking about kind of good practice for ESMPs, that mitigation measures, it's important that they're not generic. An example is work sites should include structures to avoid erosion of riverbanks, but really the mitigation measures need to be very site specific and include, for example, location, dimensions, and type of structures required with an estimate of costs, which really requires like a good understanding and all the appropriate information of the site. So in terms of an example, I'm just showing here, there's no strict format for the environmental social mitigation plan, but a general template that is used, it should include the project activity, the potential environmental social impacts, the proposed mitigation measures, institutional responsibility, so who's responsible for these measures and what the overall costs are. The key components that I mentioned before, but it can look in this format where, for example, the project activity is the use of land within the. I hear some background noise. I don't know if someone has a question or if I should keep going.
Questions at the end.
Okay, I'll keep going then. Just a quick example of the project activity is the use of land, for example, within the plant construction area and along the access road route. One potential environmental and social impact that was identified in this case is the damage to vegetation. The proposed mitigation measures include appropriate clearing techniques, so hand clearing rather than mechanized clearing. Any trees of protected species will be relocated. In case relocation is not possible, the project developer will agree with the Ministry of Environment on a practical compensation to project-specific trees. So these are examples of how we've identified the project activity, what the potential environmental and social impacts could be. There can be more than one, as you see here, for each project activity, and then the mitigation measure. In this case, the institution responsible is the contractor or the plant operating company, and then the estimated cost. So the monitoring plan should define selected indicators for ensuring that the mitigation measures described in the mitigation plan are being implemented in an effective way. So for example, if there's a mitigation measure to control noise during construction, the monitoring plan should include noise measurements during construction as an indicator for ensuring that this is done effectively. It should also ensure that the project is complying with national environmental regulatory requirements and IFAD SECAP requirements, both. It needs to address concerns which may rise during the public consultation, identifies authorities responsible for monitoring, which is an important aspect, and presents the estimated related costs. Plan. Okay, so yeah, so that was referring to the monitoring. So before we were talking to a mitigation plan, and this is the steps that are required in terms of monitoring. So how do we follow this process to ensure that the mitigation measures that are identified are appropriately and effectively carried out? So the monitoring plan defines the selected indicators, as I mentioned, for ensuring that mitigation measures described in the mitigation plan are being implemented in an effective way. It is ensuring that the project is complying with national environmental regulatory requirements. I think this is repeating. Yes, sorry, these are the same points in the last slide, but to emphasize what the monitoring plan is covering. Here is an example again. There's no strict format for the monitoring plan, but here is an example which identifies what the potential environmental impacts are. What are the parameters to be monitored? Where are they monitored? How will they be monitored and when? And then again, the estimated costs. So an example here, similar to before, is the damage to vegetation. What needs to be monitored, as was identified in the mitigation measures in the mitigation plan, are the indicator that's been identified here are clearing techniques, record of compensation provided, agreed by the Ministry of Environment. Where it needs to be monitored is at the plant site and also the pipeline and access road line routes. How is by visual and by comparison with pre-construction photo surveys. So looking at photos prior to construction, as well as throughout the process to see if there's been any monitored change. And when, so this is both when and by whom. So the interval at which it should be monitored and by who. It should be monitored monthly throughout the construction period. And again, this was also mentioned in the mitigation plan, but by the contractor or supervisor engineer. There's some other examples here, such as loss of fertile topsoil, air pollution, noise for the construction work, and basically just really identifies the indicators and the important characteristics you need to be monitoring throughout the process. This is an example of a matrix that can be used to monitor these things. And so again, there's a lot of documentation and information available through IFAD SECAP guidance materials that can help project teams during this process to do the mitigation planning and the monitoring as necessary. So in the project documentation that was shared with me, unfortunately, due to the very short time frame, I didn't have a chance to review in as much detail as I would have liked. But I can see that there's already a environmental social management plan draft in place, where you can look at what the main project activities are. There's been the identification of the potential risks and impacts, some of the mitigation measures. That ESMP is an essential feature of the environmental social impact assessment, or a separate report is required. So for category B projects, according to SECAP requirements, it depends a bit on the impacts, but I see from this project it has been decided to prepare the ESMP. So going now to implementation arrangements of the ESMP, some of the key questions are how is the overall environmental social management system works during project implementation and who are responsible to implement it, who will supervise the implementation of the mitigation plan, who will collect the data, who will analyze the data, and who will prepare the reports, how often, indicating how recommended actions are to be taken, and who will receive the reports and act upon them. So these are some of the key things that need to be identified in the development of the ESMP institutional arrangements. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. In terms of the implementation and monitoring, some of the mitigation measures, the mitigation measures in the annual work plan and budget are important for ensuring that the effective implementation and monitoring is taken out the project implementation manual into procurement plans in the NME system. Some of the biggest issues that have been identified to ESMP implementation and monitoring are when in the mitigation plan, the measures identified are too broad or unclear, so not specific enough. The indicators identified are unrealistic or inadequate. If there are infrequent site visits by team members, so that the monitoring frequency isn't as is necessary to appropriately meet the indicators that were identified. Adequate review and evaluation of monitoring aspects in reports. Failure to revise the ESMP in response to project changes during implementation, which is really important, the constant review and revision of the ESMP as things change throughout implementation. Inadequate follow-up on borrower implementation of agreed actions from previous missions, and ineffectiveness of proposed institutional capacity measures. Some solutions that have been identified by the experience with the implementing SECAP are assignments that have been shown to kind of support the effective process. The assignment of a dedicated environmental and social specialist to the PMU, make use of environmental and social climate specialists and EFAD teams in the project cycle, monitoring and reporting program needs to cover practical environmental indicators, bidding and contracting documents should include ESMP provisions on mitigation and monitoring, and active supervision. And fresh revision, as I said, the constant revision of mitigation measures and institutional settings. In terms of roles and responsibilities, the role of EFAD is to ensure adequate budget provisions for implementing measures described in the ESMP are considered, and that capacity building EFAD staff, national and project staff teams on SECAP are prepared. And supervising and implementation, monitoring, and reporting of the ESMPs. Roles and responsibilities of the project management unit are planning on implementation, monitoring, and reporting of ESMPs as soon as possible with project implementation, establishing a system for implementing, monitoring, and reporting on the progress of ESMPs, revise and update the ESMP as necessary during the project implementation, and creating a separate section in the progress reports and annual reports to report on the status of the implementation of the ESMP. And annual reporting on implementation and monitoring. Roles and responsibilities for national environment agencies include the strengthening of monitoring systems with clearly defined indicators and responsibilities, issuance of certification of authorization to start and discharge compliance at the end of projects, and preparation of reporting on annual monitoring and environmental monitoring of projects. And then finally, in terms of supervision and reporting requirements under the SECAP, so in terms of the role of SECAP ESMP supervision, guiding questions for supervision missions and SECAP ratings, the role of the environmental social management plan during supervision is to determine if the borrower carries out the project in conformity with SECAP requirements and the legal agreement made. To identify problems as they arise during project implementation and recommend to the borrower actions, activities to resolve them. To identify the key risks to project sustainability, and to recommend appropriate risk management strategies to the borrower. Sorry for repeating. Also in the SECAP guidance material, there's some guiding questions that are prepared for supervision that can help to answer some of the key requirements during supervision that I just highlighted. Some are listed here. For example, are SECAP-related documents being produced? Is the quality of the SECAP-related document satisfactory? Are the requirements used by the project stakeholders to minimize the negative impacts? Are measures in place to facilitate meaningful stakeholder engagement? These types of things are questions that need to be asked during supervision. And then during the supervision, as part of the reporting, the SECAP rating should be included using these metrics. So is it highly satisfactory, which means the SECAP made a substantial contribution to the project, satisfactory, moderately satisfactory, moderately unsatisfactory, and then so on to rate how this is going. And based again on this, then it can help in the next stages of implementation to understand if more resources need to be invested and more expertise is required to make sure that the SECAP is being implemented satisfactorily. So as I mentioned, I'm just including here the SECAP manual, which provides a lot of this documentation and relevant information. There's also individual guidance statements on different topics that may be relevant, so from biodiversity, agrochemicals, energy, all that you can see here. And there's also now updated SECAP resources as well, which have slightly different requirements, but again, the 2017 SECAP applies to this project. So this is all that, sorry, it's quite dense actually, but this is all that I have on SECAP. And it's just
We invite people to ask questions, and I have just one question in one of your slides. You mentioned that the reporting responsibility lies with the borrower or the sub-borrower. By the sub-borrower, do you mean the project authorities, or do you mean project partners also?
Again, I think it would depend specifically on the project. I'm not as familiar as I would like to be with this project. I only got the project documentation this week. And so I would have to kind of go and look and also maybe consult with my colleague who prepared the SECAP for this project of who will be the responsible authority.
Okay. So any questions?
Climate risk assessment before making any plan, we have to do this climate risk assessment. Yes, yes, what I'm saying, it's clear. Yeah. Mitigation measures, everything has to be.
Yeah, hi Anna, I'm Nitika this side. I'm the project director of LEAD. I wanted to understand about climate financing. Like, when we talking about a risk assessment, and since that will be also, that has been done at the initial stages of the project, as in during the design phase, and there will be obviously some climate risk assessment
during the duration of the project. So I wanted to know that does climate financing also mean that if there is some sort of exigencies or some sort of a climate risk factor which has come up during the project, that would also be taken into account in climate financing? And I want some details on the climate financing aspect as well.
Thanks so much for your question. I think I was a little bit breaking up, but I think I understood. So, yeah, it's important to point out that these are two different aspects of what I was mentioning. One is the fact that EFAD has included the climate as part of their SECAP procedures, and so as part of the SECAP process, also prepares a climate kind of risk screening. And as I said, because the project was categorized as high risk to climate, a requirement is to prepare this climate impact assessment, as you said, which can take place after the design. I'm not sure if you have more specific questions about the requirements of this climate risk assessment, we can talk about. But the climate finance mainstreaming process is a different process where the project has been identified that it's mainstreaming climate. I think I'm looking at the documentation and it says that the EFAD climate finance for the project is 17.7 billion, which is approximately 17% of the 105 million of EFAD financing. So 17% of this project has been considered to address climate, and therefore EFAD also has kind of mainstreaming requirements for how, because there is climate finance associated with this project, how that climate finance, there you will have identified indicators which kind of relates to this being considered a climate finance project, and those also need to be monitored throughout the project implementation. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, it does, partially. I could understand that the project budget incorporates budgeting for climate-related issues and climate factors, but just an added question to it that this can be subjected to change owing to any of the risks or anything which comes up privately. Now, just to explain it more, there are two kinds of risks we are talking about. One is that any project activity impacting the climate, that is one. Second is that project itself is dependent on certain climatic factors. So I'm talking about the second one, that since project is dependent on certain climatic factors, and since we are in a very sensitive zone, so I wanted to know that if, God forbid, something happens during the duration of the project, so does we have that scope of incorporating these exigencies into the climate financing? That was my question. But I think that it would be, depending on what climate is. And I am already saying,
oh, sorry, please go ahead. I didn't hear the last thing you said.
What did you say?
Anna, can you please come again?
Oh no, sorry, I didn't know if I missed something at the end of your intervention, but I think it's a really important point that you're making, because this is such a sensitive project to climate itself, then this financing that has been allocated for the climate impact assessment, in a similar way requires two aspects, where one, as you mentioned, there's the original climate impact assessment, which will need to take place, which essentially will need to identify the main hazards, exposure, vulnerability, adaptive capacity to climate as a baseline. But then, of course, this needs to be continually reviewed and updated to see how, in a similar way to how I mentioned that the project needs to identify which activities are most vulnerable to these climate-related impacts, and needs to consider how the project is going to mitigate these potential risks. But in the case that there is some particularly large occurrence or some large impact that is unexpected, then there should also be finance available to revise these climate impact assessments and revise the mitigation measures throughout the implementation of the project. Again, because I'm not as familiar with this project in particular, I don't know how much resources are allocated for this assessment, but I understand there are resources allocated.
Okay, thank you. No, and if I may also respond to the project director's concern. So, first and foremost, the aspect of climate finance, and we'll discuss this later during Emily's presentation. But the way it is done is when the design is being prepared, and then for all our designs, we try to assess what part of it can be calculated as climate financing. So whether there are activities that are built in which relate to climate risk mitigation or prevention of damage, etc., those are all calculated. Even the choice of, let's say, certain crops or a new crop which is more climate resilient, all those activities are counted as part of this. There are a lot of climate resilient training in the project, those are all counted towards climate finance. Now, your question, I think, is also that in addition to this, normally we should cover a lot of ground. But in addition to this, let's say a major emergency like situation arises, and if there is a major flood or something, normal activities will be able to cover through what is already planned. But in case of a major event happening, like it happened during the implementation of ISP, when there were major floods in the state, 10,000 or more people died, etc., project areas were impacted, we are always allowed to reconfigure some of the activities to respond to the, based on the severity of the impact, we can reconfigure. And this is what also happened during ILSP when there was major damage because of the floods, the project actually was restructured. So just to let you know that you should feel confident that regular climate mitigation activities will be covered through proposed activities which are counted towards climate financing. And for any major things, in addition to the contingency, we are always free to look at revising the structure. Am I right, Anna?
Yes, exactly this, that the second aspect that I usually mentioned is how climate finance is actually defined as the project. In this process, as you went through really well, is basically looking at the project activities in detail and identifying which ones are considered either to address climate adaptation or mitigation. I see that this project has the 17 million only focused on adaptation, which of course is the priority here. But you can see that we can share with you in case you don't already have, but I think you probably have, how this analysis was prepared and which activities or sub-activities were specifically identified as climate adaptation activities in the project. I see Teshre also has her hand raised, so maybe wants to add something additional.
Yes, thank you so much, Anna. First of all, thank you very much for the very comprehensive presentation on the SECAP. So I just wanted to add, one more comment from a gender inclusion lens, particularly looking at the ESMP. So when I looked at the ESMP that was developed for the project as part of the project design report, what I noticed was that under the social risks and impacts, I wanted to point out on the importance of identifying additional risks related to gender. For example, the risks related to increased gender-based violence against women, especially within the project's focus on empowering women through enterprise development, and also because I did not see any lessons learned or good practices on how the earlier project, that is the IFSP, has overcome local gender and social norms, to increase women's participation in the project. And then I also wanted to point out on the importance of identifying the There is social risk emanating from the gender inclusion strategy and action plan once that's developed. And then also already identifying the mitigation measures. For example, if we think of including gender responsiveness at the organizational level as a key aspect of the gender inclusion strategy, then some of the potential risks could include like lack of gender sensitive and socially inclusive organizational policies, practice and workplace culture, which could then lead to like sexual harassment in the workplace for both staff working at the office and also like field workers. And then another potential risk could also be lack of like women-friendly workplaces. And then also coming up with like mitigation measures for those. And then another key aspect of the gender and social inclusion strategy, particularly for this project, I think is also looking at the trainings, workshops, and meetings at the community levels with, some of the potential risks being like lack of participation of marginalized groups, or even if they participate, then in some cases it might be like limited participation, and then also like sometimes lack of gender sensitive or socially inclusive like logistical arrangements, like in terms of the training materials also, and even the way these sessions are facilitated, which might then prohibit women and other marginalized groups from even like attending or sometimes like speaking up during these meetings. And then accordingly we need to develop some mitigation strategies or actions. So just wanted to add that bit in addition to what Aaron presented. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing. That's really important as well, because I was focusing more on the environment and climate aspects because that's the areas that I work on most. But looking at the project documentation as well as the issues you brought up around gender, and based on the eligibility criteria of the project, I see it's also been identified as youth sensitive. And so there's key criteria that need to also be considered, focused on youth and how this is also addressed in the ESMP, in addition to the climate finance. So it's considered, this project is considered climate sensitive and youth sensitive, not necessarily, it's not actually ticked in terms of mainstreaming for gender transformational, but as you said, it's still essential that these aspects are included in the ESMP.
Okay, so any questions? Any more questions? Any questions? No? Okay, so thank you, Anna, and I think this was useful for the whole team to get familiar with what SECAP is and what SECAP compliance would mean in terms of the reporting as well as the field level activities that the project team has learned today. And they'll also be learning while doing. We will now break for 30 minutes for a coffee break, and we'll be back at India time 3 p.m. Is it? Is it 3 p.m.? It's 2:30 now, so half an hour, and then at 3 p.m. India time we will reconvene for the sessions on the mainstreaming themes. Cedric and Emily, is that fine?
Yeah, I'll just reach out to Emily to make sure she's available on time. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So see you in 10 minutes. And thank you. Basically, there's a lot of information which I take out सब कुछ ना क्लास करता हूँ। लेकिन क्या है कि पहले ये होता था कि जब बड़े इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर के प्रोजेक्ट्स तैयार हो गए थे ना, तो एनवायरमेंट एंड क्लाइमेट इम्पैक्ट असेसमेंट का प्रावधान होता था वर्ल्ड बैंक के सब प्रोजेक्ट में वो, और शुरुआत आपकी टेरी बात के बाद से तो ये सब और वो जो गुजरात वाला बात था, सो the financiers became very careful कि ऐसा ना हो कि उनके गतिविधियों के नतीजतन कम्युनिटीज को जितना फायदा हो उससे ज़्यादा नुकसान हो जाएगा। तो इसलिए ये करना एक एसेंशियल पार्ट था। मैं खुद पहले करीब 20-22 साल पहले नेशनल हाईवे प्रोजेक्ट में वर्ल्ड बैंक की तरफ से सोशल इकोनॉमिक एंड एनवायरमेंटल इम्पैक्ट का काम लेती थी। तो एक लंबी चौड़ी भी डिटेल रिपोर्ट करती थी, कितने लोगों को रिसेल किया जा रहा है, कितने लोगों को हटाया जा रहा है। For a highway sector project it made sense, but over a period of time ऐसा माना जाने लगा कि इस तरह के जो livelihood projects हैं, जो health awareness projects हैं, जो दूसरे उन सब में भी कुछ ना कुछ ऐसी activities हो सकती हैं जिनका दुष्प्रभाव पड़े और जिससे लोगों को नुकसान हो सके। तो what this process does for us is it makes us very conscious कि जब हम जैसे मैं आपको बताऊँ एग्रीकल्चर के प्रोजेक्ट में मान लीजिए आप बेटर मार्केटिंग तो उनके मद्देनजर आप लोगों को मोनोक्रॉपिंग की तरह करके होते हैं, राइट? तो अब आपकी मार्केटिंग बेटर, फार्मर्स का इनकम बेटर, पर 5 साल बाद वहाँ या तो सूखा पड़ेगा या तो that thing has to be kept in mind. चाहे वो एग्रीकल्चर का प्रोजेक्ट, रूरल डेवलपमेंट का, छोटे छोटे इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर करते हैं, तो वो बोलते हैं कि आप हैव टू मेक श्योर दैट देयर इज क्लाइमेट प्रूफिंग. रोड्स बनते हैं, बोलते हैं दोनों तरफ ड्रेन्स होने चाहिए, ऐसे छोटे छोटे बहुत सारे. तो जब हम प्रोजेक्ट डिजाइन करते हैं तो हम क्या करते हैं कि हम डिजाइन में ऑलरेडी इन चीजों को इंक्लूड कर लेते हैं. इफेक्ट को चूंकि रिपोर्ट करना होता है कि हम क्लाइमेट में कितना खर्चा कर रहे हैं, तो हम डिजाइन के उन सारे एलिमेंट की कॉस्टिंग को जोड़ करके कहते हैं कि 70% क्लाइमेट फाइनेंसिंग. ठीक है, तो ये तो ऑलरेडी प्लान है. अब दूसरी बात होती है जो पीडी मैडम ने पूछा कि क्या अगर कोई बड़ी इमरजेंसी आ जाए, कोई बाढ़ आ जाए या कुछ और ऐसा हो जाए, तो क्या द प्रोजेक्ट कैन डू. तो जो भी प्रोजेक्ट के ब्रॉड कॉन्टूर्स हैं, अब ये दिस प्रोजेक्ट कैन नॉट बी अ प्रोजेक्ट फॉर इमरजेंसी रिहैबिलिटेशन, है ना. वो बट जब पहले भी आया था और जब बाढ़ आई थी तो हम लोगों ने कहा कि लाइवलीहुड का फोकस बढ़ा दें, क्योंकि एक तो होता है इमरजेंसी रिलीफ, इफेक्ट डजंट डू इमरजेंसी रिलीफ. बट मान लीजिए कि वहाँ की सड़कें टूट गई हैं, वहाँ का अप्रोच की वजह से लोगों को सर्विसेज नहीं पहुँच रही है, तो कैन वी रिस्ट्रक्चर द प्रोजेक्ट एंड फोकस मोर ऑन रूरल रोड्स? यस, टू द एक्सटेंट दैट इट विल हेल्प इन आउटरीच ऑफ सर्विसेज टू द कम्युनिटीज, है ना. बट नॉट दैट दिस कैन नाउ बिकम अ रोड्स प्रोजेक्ट. वो बस वही बेसिकली इसमें. बट सेकैप जो है ना एक ऑल एनकम्पासिंग डॉक्यूमेंट होता है, इसमें सोशल इकोनॉमिक एस्पेक्ट्स कवर होते हैं, तो ट्राइबल्स की लाइफ पे क्या इम्पैक्ट हो रहा है. मुझे याद है कि जब मैं जैसे जो बता रही हूँ कि जब मैं नेशनल हाईवे वाले प्रोजेक्ट में थी, तो उत्तर प्रदेश के वो 200 किलोमीटर के स्ट्रेच में यूपी में वैसे भी ट्राइबल्स नहीं है, एक आध जगह वो सोनभद्र वगैरह इलाके में और कहीं नहीं है. उस पूरे कानपुर फतेहपुर वाले स्ट्रेच में कहीं कोई ट्राइबल्स नहीं थे. But the entire national highway 2 was divided and distributed among several people. उसमें एक जगह फिरोजाबाद में there were like 5 tribal houses, लेकिन उसके लिए पूरा ट्राइबल प्लान बनाना पड़ा, है ना. So it is because we also don't want कि कल को कोई ये criticize करे कि देखिए आपके इन्वेस्टमेंट की वजह से इतने लोगों की जिंदगी खराब हो गई, है ना. So just that it is a very stringent document. And it goes into a lot of details. वो आप जेंडर की वजह से ग्रेजुअली कई बार हम कुछ बहुत अच्छी एक्टिविटी प्रपोज कर देते हैं, उससे पता चला कि औरतों का काम जो है वो अधूरा हो गया. हमने उसको मिटिगेट करने के लिए सोचा कि दिस फोर्सेस आर So we can break for chat if the result आपको